Okay, so then chemical imbalances. Hey, so I don't think this is, or maybe I have to. It might be in your OpenStax textbook. I have to read it again. But chemical imbalances. You probably heard this term, right? So what exactly is a chemical imbalance? I mean, you usually hear it referring to someone's mental health, but what is a chemical imbalance specifically? So you hear this all the time in like pop culture. There's oh, I think I have a chemical imbalance, or this person has a chemical imbalance. Well, thing is that what are these chemicals? What is this like? Or when you take a prescription drug for a chemical imbalance, well, what is that drug? What chemicals is it so-called balancing? Well, the chemicals they're talking about are most of the time neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitter. Hey, we're all made of chemicals. Neurotransmitters are chemicals. So these are all chemicals like acetylcholine, which we're very familiar with now, and things like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, glutamate, and GABA, or for the full name, gamma aminobutyric acid. These are all chemicals. And there are many more. And again, this is where I'm telling you to, if you can ask more things on FactBat, you can research this on your own. There are more neurotransmitters, but this is the list I go for with, or I go with for PHYL 141. And again, keep it limited to what I cover because there's so much information on this. And we are going to run out of time, but I'm going to go over these neurotransmitters down the list. So if you have some more to go, don't worry. Sorry, Friday. So serotonin. So this affects many things. And again, I'm keeping it very surface level here for a reason. So it's usually inhibitory. So usually it makes the inside of a neuron more, or the target neuron, like if you release serotonin, it's going to cause it to be the membrane potential to be more negative most of the time. But this is definitely what I want you to know. Three major effects of serotonin. It affects mood, appetite, and sleep. So the thing is that you might know serotonin, like if you're taking a psychology class or even some pop culture, you might know that serotonin is one of the feel-good neurotransmitters, right? So this is what you're targeting with antidepressants such as Prozac, which is a trade name. The generic name is fluoxetine. So they're the same chemical, it's just like whether they apply a pharmaceutical label to it or not. So this is what we call an SSRI, and this affects serotonin and used for many psychiatric disorders, including depression, like major depression. So the thing is that, yeah. So side effects include anorexia or increased appetite, and then insomnia as well. So things that, let's rewind a bit. What's a SSRI? So the SSRI stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitor. So this is how Prozac affects serotonin. So what we have here is serotonin being released via into a chemical synapse. So serotonin is binding to these receptors, but we also have something called serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or serotonin reuptake channels. So remember how I mentioned earlier that one way to turning neurotransmitters off is to recycle them. So serotonin is not degraded in the major way of turning serotonin off is not breaking it down, but actually reabsorbing it. So when you reabsorb it from the synapse back into the presynaptic cell, that reduces the amount of serotonin in that synapse, thereby reducing the signal and turning it off. So how does a SSRI work, or how does a SSRI like Prozac work? Well, it involves these serotonin reuptake channels. So what it does is actually block this serotonin reuptake channel. So if there's no way for serotonin to go back into the presynaptic cell, this serotonin stays inside the synapse. If you have more serotonin in the synapse, the signal is going to be stronger. Therefore, you have enhanced neurotransmission. And then what we have here, so serotonin and fluoxetine. So again, it affects mood, appetite, and sleep. And hey, if you have a drug that's affecting serotonin, what do you think is going to help? Well, again, this is why SSRIs like fluoxetine are prescribed. They're to help balance someone's mood. And the thing is that with Prozac, well, what are some of the side effects of Prozac? One of the major side effects of Prozac is that it can cause changes in weight. Some people, they lose weight, Some people, they gain weight. Why? Because again, look at this. Serotonin by itself affects appetite. If you start changing the amount of serotonin in a person's brain via the pharmaceutical intervention, it can also affect their appetite and thus affect their weight as well. Or even things like nausea. If they have trouble keeping things down, that might reduce their appetite as well, or it make them hungrier as well. Now, serotonin can also affect sleep. Like I think, like one of my friends who was on antidepressants, like he said, like he had crazy insomnia. And if serotonin affects sleep as well as mood, if you start changing the levels of serotonin, it can also throw off your sleep as well. So it's not like these side effects are random. We already know serotonin already does affects these, but if you start changing the level of serotonin, due to, again, this is what we refer to with chemical imbalance, is that it's difficult to, I mean, we're not thinking about the brain. It's actually a very, I like to call it as like a sacred and secure place. You don't want to mess around in the brain too much, right? You want people poking needles into your brain and just to measure the level of serotonin in your brain. This is why it's often hard to, if I like when doctors prescribe antidepressants, this is why they kind of try to start off at a level and then start to increase or decrease it based on the effects. Because why? You can't just like go into someone's brain, poke a needle in it, and say, oh, you have this much level of concentration of serotonin in your brain. That's very invasive. You could do that, but who wants to get needles poked in their brain routinely, right? So this is why you need that balancing. Okay. Is melatonin a neurotransmitter as well? So melatonin is involved in neurotransmission as well. But again, melatonin is also a hormone. So the thing is like, actually we talk about melatonin more in PHYL 142. So melatonin is also a neurotransmitter. Okay, so dopamine. So dopamine, let's talk about dopamine. So emotion and attention. So this is two of the major effects. Again, there's many things dopamine does, but these are the ones I want you to know. So emotion, attention, pleasure, reward system, and also movement. But what is the reward system? So dopamine is a chemical. This is the chemical structure of dopamine. So the reward system is linking stimuli with positive feelings. So this is like feel good. So you get a signal from the outside, but it makes you feel great. So it also aids in learning. So I think that I saw a study habit or a study tip where they had a textbook and they put gummy bears on each side. So it's kind of, you get a reward as you learn. So it's trying to increase the dopamine and help you learn and stick things better in your brain. I haven't tried it myself. I don't think I've seen I have to see if there's actually a study saying it works. But what are they trying to do? They're trying to associate rewards with learning. And encourages behavior. So this is the cool thing about it. Like if you have some sort of signal and you get positive feedback, you feel good about it, you're more likely to do that, right? Well, here's the thing. Is it always good to have like feel good signals all the time? I mean, it would be great, but this is the double-edged sword with dopamine. So dopamine, if you have too much of these signals, well, this is also leads to addiction. Say you're getting dopamine signals all the time, but you're always trying to seek out that same stimuli. Say you get a dopamine rush from video games, and you're playing video games all the time. Well, it makes you feel good, but if you're addicted to it, well, you're kind of craving that, right? You want that reward, but now it's interfering with the rest of your life. Or impulsive behavior. This is an interesting thing too. Is like because people who have like, you find that the people who do these extreme sports or like have or more, because it's so involved with reward, the more you're reinforcing, the more positive feelings you have, the more likely you're to do an action, right? So this is why it's also important. Like people with impulsive behavior, they often have differences in the way they have in their balance of dopamine in their brain. And this is the other cool thing. There's something called the gambling gene. Actually, there's multiple candidates, but the thing is that most of them involve dopamine receptors. So some people are really sensitive and they get really, if they get some sort of like reward, like, I mean, with gambling, there's always risk and reward, right? And these people with the gambling gene who are prone to gambling addiction, well, again, they get a lot of pleasure, but they get pleasure on a level way higher than me. Like, actually, it's kind of funny. My mom might be one of those with that, because again, the thing is that she can go to Vegas lose $50, but if she wins $10, she acts like she won the lottery. Like if she gets any win, even if the net loss, she has a net loss, getting that reward, she goes crazy for it. So the thing is that the gambling gene is not only talking about like this dark side of dopamine and pleasure, it's also linked to impulsive and risky behavior. Because they kind of get a lot of feel-good feelings from this risk, and when it pays off, this can make them take this very risky behavior, even though the overall effect is negative. And also higher risk of drug addiction. So this is also why dopamine, even though it makes people feel good, if a drug is causing that dopamine rush, well, if these people, this becomes their primary way of feeling good and getting their dopamine fix, well, this, or heck, even getting a cup of coffee does cause a dopamine rush. So coffee addiction is linked to dopamine. Again, you do get dopamine from, but again, for the hardcore drugs, like, yeah, like both heroin and opiates and or things like crystal meth, amphetamine, I mean, that is all involving this dopamine and addiction and hence dependence on this dopamine signal. But the other interesting thing about dopamine is more than just about rewards and pleasure and risk and learning. It's also involved in movement. So the thing is that Parkinson's disease is involving the death of cells. So many cells in your brain produce dopamine, and some of these are involved in. So the thing is that Parkinson's dopamine doesn't play a role in controlling bodily movement. So things like tremor, hypokinesia, rigidity. So hypokinesia, hypo meaning lower. So then kinesiology refers to the movement, right? Kinetic movement, energy, right? So they have slowness in their movement, they have tremor and rigidity as well. And so then Muhammad Ali, right, the greatest, they say he had Parkinson's disease. I think I remember like when we were kids, and I think it was at Atlanta Olympics where he lit the torch. But you can see as he carried the torch, he was trembling due to his Parkinson's disease. And some of you might be too young, but Back to the Future, especially if your parents are 80s kids, ask them who this is. They'll know for sure. So the thing is that this is Michael J. Fox. But the interesting thing is that he has Parkinson's disease, and I don't think he acts anymore or something, but I think during a lot of his later works, before he retired from acting, or I should check if he's still retired. But this is just kind of sad thing. Due to his tremor and rigidity, he would actually like sometimes put his hand in his pocket, his character, to disguise his tremor and rigidity. So he's actually been a really good advocate for Parkinson's research. And dementia, unfortunately, is also an effect of late-stage Parkinson's disease as well. Again, remember, dopamine is not only involved in movement, but also in pleasure, rewards, and also learning as well. So things that if you have a lack of dopamine, this affects all of that. So they treat with L-DOPA. So the cool thing about L-DOPA is that, remember that blood-brain barrier I talked about and those those astrocytes? So the astrocytes that make the blood-brain barrier, so dopamine by itself, you can inject it in someone, but it's not going to go into the brain. But L-DOPA is actually dopamine with a little additional chemical groups, and those additional chemical groups can actually allow, so it's kind of like the VIP pass for dopamine to get into the brain. So it's actually a variant of dopamine, and this L-DOPA can actually cross the blood-brain barrier, get to the brain, then enzymes in the brain convert it to dopamine, so it kind of help to compensate for this lack of dopamine. And norepinephrine and epinephrine we will get into, but for neurotransmitters, let's talk about norepinephrine for now. This is a teaser, or this is like a preview. So it increases heart rate, increases alertness, and activates what we call the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system. So norepinephrine is going to be very excitatory, it's going to amp someone up, it increases all of this. We will cover that when we talk about sympathetic nervous system. But norepinephrine, this is a neurotransmitter that one of the neurotransmitters that may activate that fight or flight system. And cocaine. So what is cocaine? Well, it is a chemical. And the interesting thing is, like, is it just a synthetic chemical? Well, how was it first documented? So this is the coca leaf in South America. So I think people, like the trail guides in Machu Picchu, they don't do this stuff, but they often chew coca leaves because it has that stimulant And this is why I mentioned cocaine. So the cool thing is that it blocks the reuptake of multiple neurotransmitters. And what neurotransmitters did we cover so far? Well, we did cover serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. So this is why cocaine has all those effects. Serotonin, the effects on mood, right? So this is why people who use cocaine for those purposes affects their mood. Also dopamine, the reward system, the pleasure. So some people do cocaine for the pleasure, and norepinephrine. This is also why they have increased heart rate, sweating, and it's why they call it an upper in vernacular, because it has all that stimulatory effects. But it also increases serotonin, increasing in mood, also increasing dopamine, increasing pleasure, and norepinephrine, increasing alertness, activity, and sweating. So this is why cocaine has all the effects. It's due to those neurotransmitters being affected. Now let's see, habituation and sensitization. I think we'll go through this real quick. So habituation is when you decrease response to a constant repeat stimulus. So like the air conditioning in this room right now, I heard it. If I pay attention to it, I hear it. But if you just hear it over and over again, you can't tune it out, right? So that's what example of habituation. We will get to that. So background noises, lights, sensitization. So have you ever? It's an increased response to a stimulus. So have you ever, or classic example, you're in a dark room or a movie theater and you go out to the lobby or outside. What happens? You're even though it's maybe it's the same brightness as it was when you went into the theater, you're kind of blasted and you're kind of very sensitive and you kind of have to close your eyes, right? So that's the example of sensitization. And glutamate and GABA, this is what I wanted to get through real quick. So glutamate and GABA, I did give you a preview. So glutamate is an amino acid. It's one of the 20 amino acids that make up proteins, right? So it's the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. So this is why do I bring up this amino acid? Well, you might have heard of things like people talking about monosodium glutamate, and they think it's some totally artificial synthetic chemical, but glutamate is an amino acid. It's part of our natural chemistry, right? So the whole thing with the MSG part, it's not an artificial thing. Glutamate is in our bodies. It's part of our proteins. It's part of our amino acids. And then gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA. So this is a primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, and things like Xanax. What do they involve? Well, Xanax affects GABA in your body, so this is why it's often it's often prescribed to relieve anxiety. By increasing the amount of GABA signals in your brain, it's going to inhibit and pull back on things, prevent so much signals and also reduce the activity that's associated with anxiety. So this is how Xanax works. And I think, okay, I'm really over time right now, 15 minutes. Thank you for everyone who stayed on board. But as you can tell, I really love neurotransmitters and science, and neuroscience. I mean, this is so cool. I love it. And this is where I kind of get psychology adjacent. But yeah, thank you for everyone who stayed on. And again, this will all be up later. And yeah, thank you for getting through this week. I mean, I give you so much credit for hanging on this week, because again, I'm pretty sure for a lot of people in our nation, it's been a rough week. And I really appreciate those of you who stayed on this whole week and continue to do things, all right?